Hi folks, Tim Newman with Lite Studios, and it's time for another installment of Mastering Photoshop. This week, we are going to kick off our series on luminosity masking in Photoshop. If you've followed any of the trends in post-production editing in Photoshop at all lately, you know that luminosity masking is one of the hottest topics out there. Throughout the course of this series, we are going to look at a number of different facets of luminosity masking in Photoshop. We're going to start with an introduction, this video, as to what exactly luminosity masks are in Photoshop. We will continue on in this introduction by showing how to create simple luminosity masks. With this knowledge in hand, we will then move on to different ways to manually and quickly build luminosity masks so that you can easily use them in your editing workflow. From there, we are going to look at a number of different ways that we can apply these luminosity masks to editing our images and coming up with the best possible result. Towards the end of the series, we're going to look at some very specific luminosity masking techniques and ways in which they can be used to turn out really stellar images from what you might consider to be relatively bland images when you're looking at them as raw files to start off with. I think by the time we're done here, you're going to have a really good handle on what luminosity masks are, how to create them, and how to best use them to turn out your best final results. Before we dig into our introduction on luminosity masks in Photoshop, we should have a quick conversation about masks in Photoshop in general. Whether you realize it or not, all masks in Photoshop are in fact selections, and conversely, all selections in Photoshop are in fact masks. The two concepts and the implementation of both is indeed one and the same. Now, it's highly likely that you're used to seeing selections and not thinking about them as masks, or conversely, used to seeing masks and not thinking about them as selections, but they are universally interchangeable, and an understanding of this fact will take you a long way towards understanding how to apply masks in Photoshop, reuse them reiteratively, and really unlock the secrets to how luminosity masks can work for you. Let's take a quick look at a couple of examples in Photoshop to solidify this concept for you. So here in Photoshop, I think the best way to begin to understand the notion that selections are masks and masks are indeed selections is to play with both in a blank document such as the one that you see here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go up and I'm going to make the rectangular marquee tool active. It lives right up there in the toolbar, and I can either do that by clicking on that icon or hitting the M key until that becomes the active tool. And you can see here we have the little crosshair icon indicating that we do in fact have the marquee selection tool active, and we can simply click and hold down with the mouse, drag across the screen until we see our selection of marching ants, which, by the way, I think looks a lot like a marquee sign on Broadway in New York. Thus, this is probably where the tool got its name. This is an active selection. And as an active selection, we would say that the areas inside the selection or inside this rectangle are selected. And the areas outside this rectangle are not selected. Now that's an important thing to keep in mind because that can become a difficult state to track as your selections become more and more complicated. And in fact, this is where masks become super handy as the alternate representation of a selection because they make this state much more obvious to see. The other thing that we know about an active selection is the area within the selection is editable and the area outside the selection is not editable or protected, as it were. So the way to prove this real quickly is to hit the B key for the paintbrush tool. We can see our paintbrush tool is now active over here. This is the brush that we want. This is the standard brush tool. We are going to click on the foreground color icon here in the toolbar, and we're going to pick a nice bright red. Now I'm going to take my brush and make it a lot bigger, doing that with the right bracket key. Nice shortcut for changing the brush size up and down. And I'm going to start painting down here, and I'm going to move across that selection diagonally. Now I started painting to the lower left of that selection outside of it and painted all the way across above the selection to the upper right. But you will notice that the selection constrained our edit so that pixels were only painted in the area inside of where the selection was active. Something I want you to keep in mind. This is a concept that's going to make itself known over and over again and is certainly impacted by when you have a selection loaded as a mask. All right, so there's just a quick intro on a selection in Photoshop. Now that we have this selection, let's take a look at this selection as a mask. And the easiest way to do this is to come up here to the Select command in the menu, click on it, and say Save Selection, and we'll call it Rectangle. Easy enough, unless of course you can't type, which apparently I can't this evening. And I'm going to click on OK. Now, interestingly enough, it doesn't look like anything's happened here. However, if you come over here and click on the Channels panel, which is typically right next to the Layers panel, you will see that we now indeed have a new layer down here in our Channels panel called Rectangle. This is the mask that we just created from that active selection. Now, as a quick aside, let's assume that your Channels panel isn't showing. It's not active, like I'm doing right here. I can come up here to Windows, and I can come down here and click on Channels, and that will bring the Channels control panel back wherever it was last. I can click in this tab and drag it over here, and as soon as I see this blue frame around this set of panels, I can dock it there. And if I want it to be the second one in the list, I can click on that tab again and just gently drag it to the left, and now it's the number 2 panel in that grouping of panels. Okay, so quick, easy way to see that we have in fact created a mask. And just a real quick refresher, I'm bringing the Channels control panel if indeed yours is gone. So as a reward for our efforts so far, not only do we have this active selection that we see over here in the Document tab, but we also have a mask representation of that selection over here in this rectangle channel strip. This channel strip, by the way, is referred to in Photoshop terminology as an alpha channel. So anytime that you see masks down here stored in channel strips, those are known as alpha channels. Okay. Up above this alpha channel, you can see the red, green, and blue channels that make up the image, and then of course the composite channel that is generated for us so we can actually see all the colors in the image the way we would expect them to appear on the screen. Okay, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to do a Command D on the Mac. That's a Control D on Windows, and that removes the active selection. So remember that shortcut key in the future, the Command D or Control D to undo the active selection. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to click on the rectangle channel strip. As soon as I click on that rectangle channel strip, all the other channels, the red, green, blue channels, and the composite channel turn themselves off. And what I see is a display of the mask that was the selection that was active there. So that's stored for us. And what's really cool about having this stored for us with this channel strip active, and by the way, there are other ways to do this, I'll show you in a little bit. I can come down here and click on this icon at the bottom of the channels control panel, that little circular icon here that looks like some marching ants going around in a circle. I click on that, and the selection is back. That's a really, really cool feature about selections and masks and their interchangeability. I can save a selection and reload it later. And if I save this as a PSD file or a TIFF file, and I don't flatten the image, or I make sure that I don't turn off the thing that says discard layers, that alpha channel is saved for me and it's available next time I load this document up. So if I have a very complex selection that might take me an hour or two to make, I don't have to make it all in one session. I can save my progress back here as an alpha channel, and that's what we did with the select save selection command. And then subsequently, when I reload the document, I can reload that selection and continue to work on it. Okay, I'm going to go back up here and click on the RGB channel strip, and you'll see that the rectangle channel strip, the alpha channel here, turns itself off. We see the full color version of the image here, and the selection is still loaded from when we previously loaded it. If I go back out here to layers, I can see that this selection still works. I'll just create another layer. I'm going to come in here and make sure that I'm still using the paintbrush. I like this color of blue here, and I'm just going to paint here. There you go. That selection's still active, still providing editing boundaries for only pixels within that selection. Okay, let's step back for a minute and think about where we are right now. I think it's pretty clear the interaction between selections and masks, and conversely masks and selections. And hopefully at this point you can see that they truly are one and the same in terms of what they represent. They are just simply different viewing mechanisms for seeing what is currently selected. All right. Now, we could spend a ton of time looking at additional ways to load masks and save masks and have masks interact with one another, masking tips, tricks, and techniques, and how we can use those to do a lot of really cool things on the selection side. But that would really divert us from our goal here, which is getting an introduction to luminosity masks. So we're going to hold that off. Keep an eye out for that as a future series coming up real soon, a breakdown of some of the advanced techniques just involving masks by themselves. Okay, so at this point, what's the difference between these masks that we've looked at and these luminosity masks that we keep talking about? Well, on one hand, there is no difference. They are masks. On the other hand, it comes down to an issue of subtlety in the selection. And what I mean by that is that these luminosity masks aren't the hard-edged selections that a lot of Photoshop's selection tools give us. They are softer, gradually transitioning selections and or masks that allow us to apply edits to our pictures that don't have that hard edge look, that blend in seamlessly with luminosity levels that abut up next to them. So think about the Photoshop tools that we've used so far. They're extremely hard-edged. If you think about the rectangular marquee tool and the selection that we made and the corresponding mask that went with it, it's a very clear boundary of white that is selected and black that is not selected. And that edge is a really hard edge. Now, if we were using that to build a mask around text or around vector graphics, that hard edge might be exactly what we want. But if we think about a sunset picture with surf rolling in and some sunlight kind of bouncing off some of that surf, we may want to grab just a specific level of tonality within that surf and apply edits just to that area, but still have those edits blend in seamlessly with the areas / different luminosity levels that abut up next to it. And that's what luminosity masks give us over regular masks, that ability to make selections that are softer edged. And the way that that works is by adding one additional thing to what we've seen in the mask representations so far. So far we've seen white for selected and black for not selected. Imagine throwing in grayscale for those partially selected tones in between the white and the black. So if we had a selection in the middle that was all white and a 50% gray border around that, and then a black non-selected area outside of that, one can imagine that that 50% gray would equate to either 50% transparency or 50% opacity, depending on how you apply that luminosity mask. In order to explore this a little bit, let's jump back into Photoshop. In order to begin to understand luminosity masks a little better, we have to work with an image that offers us a wider range of tonality than our previous image did. If you think about that image, it's pretty clear cut what the tonal levels were. Here, there's a wider range of tonal levels for us to work with. And what we want to do is make specific selections in here that represent the brighter tones, the mid-tones, or the darker tones. And that's what we're going to take a look at doing right now. What we want to do in order to start making some of these luminosity selections is, once again, go over to the Channels panel. And this is very interesting because none of this exists in menus in Photoshop. This is all kind of like the secret handshake in Photoshop, if you will. But on this RGB channel strip here, if I hold down on the Mac the Command key, on Windows the Control key, and I click here, I will get a selection loaded up. And whether you know it or not, this selection represents luminosity levels in the image that are 50% luminosity or higher. That is the selection that we've had made for us right here with that Command or Control click. Now, what we want to do then is save this as a channel strip, an alpha channel. And the easiest way to do that is to come down here to this icon that I'm hovering over right here. This icon will allow us to save our current selection as a channel. So we'll click on that, and we now have an alpha channel created for us. I'm going to double click on the name of that alpha channel and call this Brights. So this is a selection of all of the pixels in the picture that are at that 50% luminosity level or higher. And I'm going to click on the RGB channel strip to bring my RGB representation back online. And you notice if I go over to the Layers panel, that selection stays active. And this indeed is a selection of the brightest areas in the image. And I can prove that real quickly, although this won't be a graceful edit. I can come in here and say, let's add an adjustment layer, and let's just make it brightness and contrast. And we're going to double click here and take the brightness up, and you'll notice that it's very focused on the brightest area of the image, that there are a lot of areas in the image that aren't being touched by this. But it's also very subtle across the image as a whole. So it is a selection or mask that has a lot of grayscale values in that mask. And if we want to see that, it's really easy. I can come here to the mask representation in this adjustment layer that we just created, hold down the Option key on the Mac, the Alt key on Windows, and click on that. And now we're seeing, believe it or not, the mask for the brightest areas in the picture. So the areas that are bright in this mask are allowing the most editing to happen. The areas that are darkest in this mask are allowing the least amount of editing to happen. And those ones that are hovering in those grayscales in between, they are allowing various levels of this edit to take effect. Hopefully that makes sense, and hopefully that notion of looking at the mask and thinking about the bright areas having the most impact and the dark areas having the least impact makes sense. Okay, I want to delete this layer, this adjustment layer. I'm dragging it off to the trash because we want to do a couple of other things here before we wrap up with this tutorial. Once again, we are going to go over to the channel strip, and we're going to make that active. And we remember that a command click on the Mac or a control click on Windows will give us a selection that is the areas that are 50% or brighter tonality in the image. Well, if I want a selection that is less than 50% tonality throughout the image, just a simple matter of inverting the selection that we just made. So I can come up here and go Select, Inverse, or you can see that's a Shift Command I on the Mac or a Shift Control I on Windows. And now you will see, and it's subtle, that this selection is flipped around. And now we are just selecting the darkest areas of the image. Here's where you can really see the effect of that, and that is when you come down here and click on this icon again to create another new channel strip. And you double click on this and you say, this is the darks. And you can see as you're looking at this that the brightest areas in this mask are in fact hovering over the darkest areas in the image. And if I turn my RGB channel strip back on and go back out here to layers, and this time I'm going to do an adjustment layer, and I'm going to do brightness and contrast again, and I'm going to take my brightness and contrast slider up and down, you can see that is in fact affecting the darker areas of the image the most, and then gradually tapering off through the midtones and having very little effect on the brightest areas of the image. But the effect overall is still one that's entirely subtle. Okay, we're dragging this adjustment layer into the trash, and we're going to take a look at one more luminosity mask before we wrap up here. Okay, at this point we've targeted the brights in the image and we've targeted the darks in the image. Let's think about the midtones in the image. And getting the midtones in the image is a rather interesting approach, one that makes sense when you think about the subtle shift in tonalities in the brights mask and the darks mask. But it does leave you a tad confused the first time you do it. So we're going to go through this very slowly and have you think about what's happening here and what the results are that we're seeing on the screen. The first thing we're going to do while we're out here in the layers control panel is we're going to select the entire image. That's a Command A on the Mac or a Control A on Windows. And up till now, you've probably just thought about this as a selection of pixels that's on the current layer that you're on, but in reality, it's also a selection of every level of luminosity that's in the picture. Now we're going to come back to the channels control panel. And what we want to do is we want to take away the brights and we want to take away the darks. Now, you remember the bright mask and the dark mask weren't hard-edged masks. They were graduated levels of luminosity. So I will be subtracting a fair amount of brights from the image and a fair amount of darks from the image, but I will be left with a mid-tone band there in the middle that we can work with. So what we're going to do is we're going to hover right over where it says brights here. And on the Mac, we're going to hold down the Command and Option key. On the Windows machines, that would be Control and Alt key. And you'll notice that we now have a little square with a minus sign in it. And what that's telling us is Photoshop is going to load the selection that's in this alpha channel and subtract it from the All or Command A, Control A selection that's currently active. So we go ahead and do that, and what we now have is a selection of everything minus gradual tonalities working their way up to the brightest areas in the image. Now we're going to come down here to the darks alpha channel, and again on the Mac it's a Command Option, on Windows it's a Control Alt keystroke combination, and you see we have that square with the minus sign again telling us that we are going to subtract all the darks from our current selection. And our current selection is what is remaining from all the luminosity levels with the brights already subtracted from it. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that. Now at this point we get a really interesting message that pops up. It says, warning, no pixels are more than 50% selected. The selection edges will not be visible. For a long time before I really studied masks and luminosity masks, I thought this meant that no pixels were selected. But in fact, what it means is there are pixels that are selected. It's just that the marching ants are not capable of displaying them because they are below that 50% luminosity or that 50% opacity level. And so we do in fact get a selection, but we don't get the marching ants to go with it. I'm going to go ahead and click on OK. Now it looks like everything's gone awry and that we don't have any selection there, but in fact we do. And if we come down here again and click on this icon here that allows us to create our current selection as a channel, you'll see that we get another alpha channel here. I'm going to double click on it and call it midtones. But you'll also see that there is in fact a mask here. This mask is very dim. The opacity levels in these grayscales are pretty high, which means that we're not going to have a huge effect from this mask when we use it as selection for an adjustment layer, but we will still see an effect. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here. I'm going to turn the RGB channel back on, and then I'm going to show you another new shortcut here, which I think is pretty cool. If I hover over the midtones channel strip and I hold down the command key on the Mac or the control key on Windows, I get the little icon below the pointing finger icon here telling me it's going to load the selection. So I don't even have to turn that channel strip on like I have in the previous two examples of the brights and the darks. I can select it with that shortcut keystroke combination. And here's my warning message again. It says the selection edges will not be visible. That's fine. I know there's a mask there, and because masks are selections, I know that there is a selection here, even though we can't actively see it. Come back out here to the layers control panel. I'm going to add yet again a new adjustment layer with brightness and contrast. You'll see immediately our mask gets applied to that adjustment layer as it has the previous two times we've done it. And if I come in here and adjust brightness, you can see that the brightness is indeed being adjusted, but it's not really having an effect on the lightest areas of the image or the darkest areas of the image. It's staying pretty well constrained to the midtones in the image. I could therefore bring these midtones up quite a bit if I wanted to. So there you go, brights, darks, and midtone masks. Now, we can achieve a much finer level of luminosity granularity than we have so far, but this is a really great starting point in understanding how to make luminosity masks and then how they can target specific luminosity levels in your image. Hang out for just a second. I'm coming right back at you with the wrap up on some of the thoughts of what we've seen so far. See, I told you I'd be right back, and here I am. All right, so far you have learned that selections and masks are one and the same. And hopefully you see the value in the interchangeability of the two and how they can make selections much clearer to you when viewed as masks than using the marching ants by themselves. You've also learned the difference between regular masks and luminosity masks, and it comes down to including varying levels of luminosity as grayscale pixels within those luminosity masks. And correspondingly, when those luminosity masks are reloaded as selections and you go back to the layers control panel, you know now that they offer you very targeted adjustments to specific luminosity levels within the image. We obviously have a lot more work to do than just creating brights, darks, and midtones luminosity masks. There's much finer level of control that we want to gain here, and we'll get to that in the next video, but I think this is a good stepping off point for right now. Take some images and explore creating a bright, dark, and midtone luminosity mask, saving those as alpha channels, and just try sampling those as selections with adjustment layers back in the layers control panel so you can get a feel for what they do. We've really just scratched the surface here in terms of luminosity masking and luminosity editing, but I think this is the right foundation to get us started. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you coming back and seeing us over and over again. A new series, or should I say a new video in this luminosity series, will be coming really soon. I'm really excited about this one, so make sure you subscribe down there at the bottom with that red subscribe button, and keep coming back and checking out our new content that we put out all the time. And remember, as we always say, learning equals skills, practice equals mastery. We'll see you out there.